7.4, is Patrick available on Zoom? Okay. 7.4A, there he is, consideration of increasing the Cannabis Equity Grant funds from a maximum of $50,000 up to $150,000 per applicant, and B, consideration of resolution of the Lake County Board of Supervisors authorizing the State of California Cannabis Equity Act grant funding. It says admin office, but it's treasurer tax collector.
He's a hybrid today.
Okay.
Yeah, good afternoon, board. I'm just going to provide some background information and some additional thoughts on this since I was working on it before I transitioned to treasurer tax collector. I've been asked if I could give a brief overview of the equity grant program and just where we're at in terms of funding. For the board to remember, we first received the Type 1 grant, which was $150,000. That was to conduct the equity assessment and create the equity program manual. That was completed in 2020. At the end of 2020, we applied for our first Type 2 grant funding, which is where the state actually gives the money to implement a cannabis equity program. We received our first round of funding in 2021 for $888,000 approximately. And then in January of 2022, last year, we were notified we were going to receive another 1.9 million. So ultimately that gave us a little over 2.8 million to work with between those two grants. Last year, we opened up the application process, and originally they were due, I believe, May 27th. We ended up extending it to June 1st. Throughout the summer, admin staff worked on reviewing those applications and determining who met that equity criteria. We had previously consulted your board about what direction to take with these funds. A lot of our sort of peer counties were struggling in terms of how to implement this program. And ultimately what we settled on, given our capacity, was that using it to assist cultivators and cannabis businesses with county taxes and fees was probably the most prudent and most viable option. And that is the direction your board ultimately gave. Up to $50,000 of expense could be covered for those county related taxes and fees. There were ultimately 23 applicants that were awarded some type of funding, a total of $723,000 in tax, and there was just a little under $2,000 in CDD fees. And that's because last year, all of the application decisions were made later in the year, and the CDD fees for existing applicants were due earlier. So going forward, there are people who may get CDD fees paid, but generally last year, the majority of money went to taxes. In December, the admin office was able to submit another grant application for $800, and ultimately notified this year that another $836,000 is intended to be awarded, and that pertains to the resolution before your board today. I think now some of the concerns that have come up during this process, when we first looked at how much money we were going to spend and what our estimate was, that was before the tax rate reductions. And a lot of the equity applicants, there were others who were approved, but they ended up going non-operational or greatly reduced their cultivation size. So we did not spend as much money as we originally anticipated of that first grant batch, that $888,000. The state has extended that into April, I believe, and we still have until fall to spend that 1.9 million. The application that was submitted for that 836,000, that maintains the same model that currently exists, recommending the use for county taxes and fees. That's what was submitted to the governor's office, GoBiz. And so at this point, I think staff would recommend that you increase that cap from the 50,000 to the 150. One recommendation was 150,000, because there are cultivators who have already hit the max that we were able to pay. So not only could we potentially pay part of their second installment, we could then use that same funding to help pay to cover this year's tax liability. This program, I guess I would note, this funding may very well be the last batch of significant funding we get. After this year, the state has changed the guidelines. So going forward, the county would have to put up, essentially 500,000 in matching funds to continue to receive state funds, and the pool of state funds is going to shrink. So I guess I would just note that this money we have may very well be the last funding that we receive. Most of it has to be spent by fall. The rest of it would have to be spent by the end of next year. I don't have the exact dates, but likely September or October. So if there are any other questions, I'm happy to take them. I wanted to provide that background, and the administrative office will be handling the grant materials going forward, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Supervisor Spatier?
I think this is a good idea in order to make sure we don't see money not being utilized that we're already obtaining from the state. And this helps to potentially keep certain applicants afloat as we keep going through this roller coaster ride of industry stabilization. So in support.
Supervisor Green?
Yeah, thank you, Patrick, again, for spending a little time with me yesterday. As pointed out, this, cannabis equity is not a phrase that rolls off the tongue to immediate understanding. And cannabis equity grants were not a creation of the legislature. It was kind of a late add-on to Proposition 64 in 2016. And the goal was similar to what's stated here, not to help businesses, but to help individuals, people who had been targeted by the drug war, suffered under the drug war, people who might have the easiest way getting up. And what has happened over the last several years, depending on the jurisdiction, whether you're a city or a county, is two things. One, the creation of incredibly onerous regulations such that assistance is needed for equity applicants to even have a prayer of getting in. And then the creation of these equity grant programs that are supposed to benefit, again, individuals, not businesses. And here we are in Lake County, and we're continuing to talk about our permitting program, but we barely have 100 permits after 6 years. There's a whole chunk of our residents who have no ability to bring an application and therefore, by default, have no access to these equity funds. And I don't have the entire roadmap, but clearly the great lion's share of permit holders in this county are affiliated with LLCs and C Corps. There aren't many sole proprietors in here. So when we identify individual applicants who are going to be receiving these funds, or at least who are going to have their tax bills paid, there's an application form here, and they can check some check boxes that they fit the criteria. They can state that, they were formerly incarcerated as part of the drug war, that they suffered some life circumstance as a result of the drug war. But that attestation by an individual doesn't necessarily guarantee that an individual will be the primary beneficiary of equity funds. In the cities, for example, you see a lot of creativity, the use of straw men and women, the use of equity applicants who are funded by very non-equitable sources of revenue. To my knowledge, we have no ability at this point to track how effective we've been with our equity funds. I know there's a subcommittee on equity that's meeting at the state level that is now, however many years later, trying to figure out how we would start doing data collection. So I don't believe the state has any real constructive knowledge of how these tens of millions of dollars have been spent statewide. And so I can't revisit 6 years of history or the 2 years of history of this program locally. I'm just going to state that I have very grave concerns about how this is rolled out. And it's no disservice to anybody who has benefited as an individual from these funds. But I have a strong suspicion that corporations have benefited at least as much, if not more, from distribution of these funds. And I cannot support this on that basis. Thank you.
Okay, any other comments? Public input?
There are no hands in Zoom.
Okay, then I'll bring it back to the board for action.
So there's two. Can I do it all in one?
Our suggestion would be to do them separately.
Okay, so I move to approve the increase of the Cannabis Equity Grants funds from a maximum of $50,000 up to $150,000 per applicant.
Second.
Motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
And Part B, I offer the resolution. That's why I couldn't do it in one.
Supervisor Simon.
Yes.
Supervisor Sabatier.
Aye.
Supervisor Crandall.
Aye.
Supervisor Green.
Nay.
And Supervisor Pyska.
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Patrick.